The launch of Apollo 8 went beautifully, even more amazing when you consider the problems that they'd had on the previous Saturn V launch. And, you know, any launch of the Saturn V was just an incredible event, but even more so when you have the first three people riding it, and you know that if everything works, those three people are going to be the first human beings to travel to another celestial body. Well, of course, even getting into orbit, there was still a chance that something would be wrong with the spacecraft, and in fact, Frank Borman's worst nightmare had been that they would get into Earth orbit, but some problem would arise and mission control would not allow them to go to the moon, and he'd have to spend, 10 days in Earth orbit, basically a repeat of Gemini 7, although with a much roomier cabin, but still, that was basically Borman's worst nightmare. So he was very relieved when Mission Control gave the go-ahead for what was called translunar injection. And that was a several minutes long burn of the third stage engine. And that took place about 3 hours after launch. And you can see here, this is an amazing photo from a telescope in Hawaii, actually photographing the firing of that third stage engine in the night sky over Hawaii as Apollo 8 fires its third stage and heads to the moon. Well, the burn went perfectly. The astronauts cast off the third stage, and then they turned around, and this is what they saw. They saw the Earth as no humans had ever seen it before, as a planet. You can see just an absolutely gorgeous view here. All of South America visible at the bottom, and up to the upper left is North America, mostly hidden under clouds. And on the right, passing into the evening and nighttime portion of the Earth, is the west coast of Africa. So just a truly astonishing view from about 10, 15,000 miles as you look back from the moonward bound Apollo 8. On the way to the moon, just like Apollo 7 had done, the Apollo 8 crew sent back a number of television transmissions. You see on the left there Jim Lovell wishing his mom happy birthday from Apollo 8, and on the bottom there is Frank Borman waving and telling everybody he feels well. And that was not just a casual piece of information, because on the way out to the moon, about a day after leaving Earth, Borman came down with pretty violent flu-type symptoms. He was throwing up, he had diarrhea. It was very unpleasant for everybody involved, as you can imagine, in zero-G. But by the next day, Borman was feeling much better, and the mission was able to continue with no problems. And you can see on the upper right a view of the dwindling Earth from the television camera aboard Apollo 8. Well, on Christmas Eve of 1968, just past midnight in the U.S., Apollo 8 fired its big service module engine and went into orbit around the moon. And the crew became the first humans to see the moon close up. This is one of hundreds of pictures they took from lunar orbit. And they also became the first humans to look back and see the Earth from lunar distance, from almost 250,000 miles away. And the view was even more spectacular, even made more of an impact, because it came to them by surprise. They were coming around from the far side of the moon at the end of their third orbit, and Frank Borman was maneuvering the spacecraft into a new orientation, and Bill Anders, who had been looking at the moon and photographing the moon, now looked out the window and saw the Earth rising beyond this barren lunar horizon, and with the Hasselblad camera and the 250 millimeter telephoto lens, he took first a black and white image and then a couple of color images one of which became one of the great icons of the 20th century. And that's this photograph here. And, you know, the impact of seeing the Earth rising beyond that bleached, barren horizon was to emphasize the beauty of the Earth and the fact that it was so utterly different from the world that they were orbiting. The moon, of course, has no atmosphere, no water, no life, and basically looked to the astronauts like a burned out cinder. And the Earth, of course, is an oasis of beauty and color and life in the void of space. In fact, Jim Lovell later referred to it as a grand oasis in the vastness of space. So on Apollo 8 and on every mission to the moon, it was the sight of the Earth from lunar distance that became the greatest experience, that had the greatest impact of the entire lunar experience. Well, it was Christmas Eve, and that only added to the magic of the moment. And Frank Borman and Jim Lovell and Bill Anders did send back a number of television transmissions, and especially, or 2 transmissions. The second one took place on Christmas Eve evening in the United States, and it was made even more wonderful by the fact that the astronauts read from the book of Genesis. And here is a clip from that.
We are now approaching lunar sunrise, and for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was all the white day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
Well, you can imagine what an impact that made for everyone listening, and especially the mission control teams who did not know that this was going to happen and felt the impact of what they had accomplished. Of course, there was one very important step yet to come, which was the firing of that SPS engine to get the astronauts out of lunar orbit and headed back to Earth. And that took place after the 10th orbit over the far side of the moon. This is a painting by the great space artist Robert McCall showing that moment. And as they came around from the far side of the moon with the tense mission control teams waiting to hear if they had made it, Jim Lovell broadcast a message of triumph. Please be informed, there is a Santa Claus. And you know, the next day, when the news was printed, among other places, on the front page of the New York Times, it was very clear that Apollo 8 had begun a new era in exploration, because no longer was exploration something that had to be shared after the fact. You know, we didn't have to wait for the letters to trickle in from the frontier. We didn't have to wait for the explorers to make long journeys home with their tales of exploration. No, we were able to witness it as it happened on live TV. And even the processing of the impact of that exploration took place in real time. On that front page of the New York Times was an essay by the poet Archibald MacLeish that talked about this perspective that we'd gotten from astronauts orbiting the moon, looking back at the Earth as a spaceship, and that we were all riders on that spaceship together, brothers in eternal cold. So this was an absolutely stirring moment, and one that really typified the impact that Apollo would have on all of humanity. I'm Andy Chaikin. This is the history of spaceflight and space technology. We'll see you next week.